We have invited Dr. Jok Madut Jok, who is the Executive Director of the Sudd Institute, a public policy research center based in South Sudan. He joins us on Skype from Syracuse, New York State, in the United States of America. Jok, good evening, and thank you so much for joining us.
Good evening, ma'am. Pleasure to do it.
Dr. Jok, in terms of the continued demand for civilian rules, protesters out in the streets again in Sudan after, there was a lull in their protest movement after the June 3rd crackdown where we saw loss of life. What's the latest on the ground? Do you think these continued protests will yield some results this time around?
Yes, as you will recall, the 30th of June is a very significant day in relation to the toppling of the previous regime of Omar Hassan al-Bashir. The June 30th date was the date when he took power in a military coup. So the protesters were trying to stage this coup to actually press ahead with the idea that the people who have now come to rule Sudan, the Transitional Military Council, are nothing but a continuation of al-Bashir's rule. And for a while, the discussions between what is known as Forces for Change and Freedom, on the one hand, and the Transitional Military Council on the other, had stopped negotiation following the massacre of June 3rd and June 4th in Khartoum, when the Rapid Support Force, the militia affiliated with the government, attacked the protesters and broke up much of that protest after killing over 100 people. Now, the new situation is that the regional powers, including government and the AU and the IGAD countries, are pressing that these two sides come back to a negotiating table. Otherwise, Sudan is under the threat of a more explosive situation if these talks don't resume. Right now, the Transitional Military Council is insisting on forming its own civilian government and then hold elections after 1 year. The protesters are saying none of that will happen under their watch, and they are pressing ahead with the protests. Protests which, as images have shown, have become bigger and bigger, even surpassing what we had seen before, aiming to have million people march onto the streets in Khartoum. And I think it's not going to be easy to quell this protest. The only thing that is going to save Sudan from continued unrest is a return to negotiation as the African Union, the Intergovernmental Agency on Development, and Prime Minister of Ethiopia, Dr. Ahmed Abiy, are saying that negotiations are the only way to go. And what they need is for all the African countries to stand behind this and to challenge the Middle Eastern countries that are supporting the Sudanese government, who are trying to disrupt this process. The European Union is also trying to undermine the AU position and Dr. Ahmed Abiy's position. And I think all those countries, if they have to be involved, they should only be involved behind the desire to resume the talks, but not to undermine what the AU is doing and what the Prime Minister of Ethiopia are doing.
Dr. Jok, in terms of the Middle East, the EU, why would they be undermining the talks that are taking place or the efforts made by IGAD, the AU and Ethiopia?
On the part of the Middle Eastern countries, particularly the UAE and the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia and Egypt, their main issue here is that they have become convinced that the Transitional Military Council is the only entity that is going to consolidate peace and bring back stability. And in fact, the shooting of people on June 3rd was almost clearly at the behest of these countries. These countries are also, particularly Saudi Arabia, which continues to send arms to Sudan, are basically undermining the protests and the future stability of the country. The EU is simply not uniting behind any particular agenda, and each of the member states has their own position. And Germany is leading at the moment in trying to bring envoys from those countries that I've just mentioned from the Middle East so that they come up with a plan. That plan does not include the people of Sudan. It does not include the protesters. It does not include the political leaders. And so while the whole world needs to do something, they can only do something if they are rallying behind the aspirations of the Sudanese people, and not for any of them, whether European Union or the Middle Eastern countries, even the African Union. They are not coming up with their own agenda. They are simply asking the Sudanese people to give them priority issues, and the AU has got it. The AU understands it. Ahmed Abiy understands it. The countries in IGAD region understand this, and they are the ones who are supposed to be given much say along with the Sudanese people.
Now, in terms of the TMC, why are they so reluctant to share power or to hand over power to a civilian government, to a civilian-led government?
It's very easy. They see the handover of a government to a civilian government that is a product of a negotiation, is that it's going to come for their necks, because many of the members of the junta are basically people who have gotten their hands very, very bloody over the years of the war with Darfur and Southern Blue Nile, Kordofan, and all these places, including the protest and the killing of people the other day. I think they are afraid that giving power to a transitional civilian government will simply mean that they will be now required to account for these actions and for the people that have died under their watch.
In today's protest action, one person has reportedly lost their life, and there's resilience of the protesters still going out in the streets and fighting for the right for civilian rule. Do you think that this will have an impact on the TMC to eventually relinquish power or to go back to the negotiating table?
I think going back to the negotiating table is imminent. Especially that the more brutal the regimes become, the more people will go on the street, and there will be no end in sight. So I think going back to the talk will be the only way out. Obviously, there are some requirements in order for the protesters to actually make a difference, and that is if the military itself is divided between the militias that are supporting the TMC and the professional Sudanese armed forces, or the other hand, supporting if they express some kind of solidarity with the people, then this protest will end much easily and in a more peaceful way. But so long as the military is still unable to intervene on the side of the protesters, it will be extremely difficult for the protests themselves to lead to any kind of toppling of the TMC. So the negotiations are the only way out.
Dr. Jok, with regards to the people on the ground, obviously showing resilience, in terms of the international community, you mentioned the fact that not a lot has been done, and in terms of the AU and IGAD, they know the issues and what needs to be put to the table. Do you think they have enough support in ensuring that on the civilian side, protesters or the forces for change are able to come together with the TMC and in agreement take Sudan forward?
Definitely. I think what the AU and Ethiopia's government and IGAD need at the moment is for all the other African countries, especially Sierra Leone, which is holding the presidency of AU, South Africa, which has a lot of weight on the continental issues, all to come together and express their support to the AU position, so such that the AU position and Ethiopia's position is now brought to the Sudanese people of both sides in a kind of realpolitik, telling them that if they don't talk, their country is going to probably disintegrate under their feet, and that will be not to the benefit of anyone. So I think there is that need for all the African leaders to stand behind individually and collectively this idea of pressing for negotiation.
Dr. Jok, thank you so much for joining us. We'll leave it there for now. That is Dr. Jok Madut Jok. He is the Executive Director of the Sudd Institute, a public policy research center based in South Sudan.